I always find myself laughing at the beginning of these videos. It's great to have a positive attitude, right?
It is.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm with my most esteemed colleague, Ron Nielsen. He is the author of The History of Federal Lands in the United States, .com, by the way. The link will be in the box if you're interested in knowing more about the book. You can follow us as we go through the book on video series. We're not sure how many videos that's going to take, but we're willing to be able to do as much as we can. But because of the fact that since I read the book, I have found that every single issue that we're dealing with today deals with this federal land issue. And so it makes me believe that the book that Ron had taken 20 years to write is extremely timely. And I think that you're going to see that too. So today, as we deviate from part of the book series, we're going to be going off on a tangent and talking about the reality of what we're dealing with the Texas immigration border issue. It's something that's very hot right now. It's something that's very relevant. If you will stay tuned with us till the end of the video, you are going to realize in very short order that this is a perspective that you probably won't hear anywhere else, which makes us rather unique for this video and obviously unique to share it. And so without further ado, Ron, thanks for joining me again. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Cool, man. So, man, there's just so much we can talk about. Um,
I know.
anyway, so I think where we ended up leaving off last time on the first video, um, was dealing with the chronology between the Articles of Confederation, when it started, how long it lasted, the article let's see, the Articles of Confederation, our Constitution, and then the interesting component right about in the middle, which was the formation of the Northwest Ordinance and what it was for. And as you told me before, it wasn't a form of government. It wasn't a new articles. It wasn't anything other than the established land disposal program, which I think is important for people to understand out of this. The other thing that's important to understand is that out of all of the issues that we're dealing with, it has come very apparent to me that everything that we're dealing with deals with what Ron said in his book and that it all deals with land. So that makes Ron the most unique character in the country because he wrote a book that nobody else did about the fact that everything is connected to land. And so, in an effort to try to stop talking, I'm going to hand the reins over to Ron, and he's going to talk about that. So, before we get started, Ron, and talk about Texas and Governor Abbott and the lawful authority or legal authority of the feds or the states and all that, which we'll get into, is to be able to define two terms that people are going to need to know right off the bat so they can get their head around this. One of them is you mentioned something called concurrent jurisdiction. The other one is called exclusive jurisdiction. And then later on, I think whether you decide to or not, you go into something called proprietary. Can you go ahead and give us a brief overview? And then I will try to simplify that if it seems too complicated.
Sure, sure. So, the historical component of the jurisdictions goes all the way back to the Northwest Ordinance, right? So, the Northwest Ordinance sets, let's just say this, the Northwest Ordinance created uh, a jurisdiction for the United States government to conduct its land program in a manner in which it had the least amount of uh, interference from the states and from the people. This jurisdiction that they utilized was exclusive jurisdiction, which was the same jurisdiction applied to Washington, D.C. in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, because it was understood that the lands that were being acquired, and you can look at the Louisiana Purchase as part of this, whenever under 1817, whenever the federal government can purchase land. Now, yes, in 1817 it says from the states, but this is a complicated issue because the property in question didn't belong to the United States government and it didn't belong to the states. In the Louisiana Purchase, it belonged to France.
So let me ask you something. So in order to be able to, sorry to interrupt you, I do that once in a while. If
That's okay.
so, in order to simplify what you said, and I think I mentioned this to you before, I'm going to understand exclusive jurisdiction for I think what you're talking about right now, right? Where it came from, it was established by the Northwest Ordinance, to be able to create a land program with the least amount of interference between the feds and the states, is not to upset that relationship, right?
Right. So yeah, in
Okay.
essence,
And one more thing.
yes.
And one more
Go
thing.
ahead.
And for the people that are not really with us at this point, is exclusive jurisdiction as opposed to concurrent jurisdiction means exclusive jurisdiction that is being exercised by the entity makes that entity exercising that jurisdiction the supreme authority over its inferior, right?
That's right.
In other
That's right.
words, exclusive jurisdiction would mean if the federal government was exercising that, it would mean that it would force the states to be more in a submissive or inferior position than the federal government itself.
That's right.
Okay, go on.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it. You can look at it, and it has been looked at it from the Article 6 lens, in that the federal government is supreme in the sphere, right? From the Article 6 lens,
Mhm.
but it goes more, it's deeper than that. It goes further than that. You can see this in United States versus Dorr, in which the Supreme Court of the United States literally said that the exclusive power is to be construed to also affect private rights, in that if exclusive jurisdiction is being applied, then the government's rights are superior to everybody else's. Or it says it this way, that the guarantee of private rights is not necessarily applicable.
Which means when you're on federal land, you may or may not have the ability to exercise the rights, or to be most simple, the federal government may or may not acknowledge those rights, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's
Good.
exactly right.
Okay.
So the exclusive jurisdiction is more than just a supremacy clause thing. It also works against private rights, because, as we know from Barron versus Mayor of Baltimore, that private rights work a restriction against government action. And the way that the federal government interrupts that is to apply exclusive jurisdiction. That way, it has a supremacy, and it can displace private rights.
Wow. And
Okay.
everybody thinks that the federal government, because we have a Bill of Rights and we have a Constitution, and the rights are unalienable according to the Declaration of Independence, that if we had rights at all, that they would be more protected under the federal jurisdiction or under exclusive jurisdiction than they would be under the states,
And
right?
you would
So,
think so, but the
yeah.
vast amount of case law that came out of the government's land program tells us a different story. We didn't know, prior to a few cases that got into federal court, we didn't really know from a historical lens how the government was operating its land program. But
Mhm.
now we have enough case law to where we can piece it together. And the government was operating its land program under its exclusive power.
Okay, I have a question then.
Yeah.
So it's just great having just talking about this stuff. So I eat and live and breathe it. So okay, so this is interesting then. So we're talking about the federal government exercising exclusive jurisdiction, right? I'd say over the states and the
That's
people.
right.
But it's interesting enough to know that when you exhaust your administrative remedy in the state, that somehow the states or the citizens appeal to the federal government for remedy. Isn't that a bit of a
Yeah. So,
contradiction in terms? Am I
well,
on
no,
right? Am I on? Am I?
yes, there,
Okay.
I mean, it depends on the situation, right? So let's take your model that you just laid out. You've got to you exhaust your administrative remedies. This means you're in an administrative setting, and in an administrative setting, chances are very good at the beginning of your case you're going to be fighting your case in what's called a tribunal.
Mhm.
Tribunals are um, courts that the EPA has, that are individual courts to the EPA. They're in the EPA, right? They're not part of the Article 3,
Three
Article
course.
1 system.
Sure.
And then you have also Forest Service tribunals, in which you can have a tribunal before a Forest Service employee, right? So these tribunals are specific to exclusive power
Right. Okay.
because they existed as a function of the territorial jurisdiction being applied to, let's look at it this way. The Northwest Ordinance created a judiciary. That judiciary was a tribunal. That's
Okay.
what it was. It was a tribunal.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at them as territorial courts.
Okay.
And that would be proper.
Okay.
That's what they are.
Okay. So when we're appealing to exhausting our administrative remedy before we end up going into the federal court system, and maybe I'm just taking us off on the wrong path because we haven't even talked about concurrent stuff yet, but and I
No,
don't want to do
you're
this,
right on
but
target, brother.
I just want to make sure that this is part of the equation. So if we're going to be going into the courts, the states are, the citizens are, whatever, that when we enter into that, we know that on the state level that we are entering into an Article 1 court system, most likely, because they're administrative courts, and I'm assuming it's the same for the federal government as well, right?
Yes, the way that the federal government is supposed to handle disputes in-house, meaning between agencies or between branches of government, they're supposed to be handling the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 process, and that is rules and regulations for the government to operate.
Right.
So in order for the government to be able to dispose of these disputes internally, it created these Article 1 courts.
Okay, and I had to clarify that according to the Idaho Constitution, it's not Article 1, it's Article 3, but I think it's still the same premise because we're still looking at the legislative, which is Article 1 in the federal government, and Article 3 in the judicial of the federal government, rather than Article 3 of the state government. So anyway, we're talking about legislature to legislature and the judicial to the judicial. So
Well, I'm
regardless of
glad
what
that you
articles.
brought that up because okay, so one would ask the question normally in this situation, okay, so you've got these territories and they've got these Article 1 or tribunals, they've got these tribunals in them in which these territorial courts are handling things separately from the Article 3 power of the government, right? So you got the constitutional government and the Article 3 judiciary. And then you have this Article 1 tribunal judiciary handling things very differently. All right. So the question I think anybody would normally want to ask is, okay, well, if you're going from a territory to a state, what happens to the judiciary? That's a valid question.
Right.
Well, in the state of Idaho, in the Admission Act, Section 16 and 17 of the Admission Act cover that. And when the federal government, in conjunction with the state, wrote the Admission Act, they made the state judiciary of the territorial court. Now, we know what that means. We know is that that's what the language says.
Okay. Admission Act. Okay.
It also, not just the state court, but the state and the federal courts were made successors of the territorial court, the district court, the federal district court.
So some of the action items that we could include from this obviously is reading our federal constitution, reading our state constitution, but you were talking about the Admission Act as well.
Yeah, the Admission Act is very important because it tells us how the judiciary was going to go from being a territorial judiciary into, the state of Idaho, and then the federal judiciary under Article 3 power. So here's what happened. In the state of Idaho, there was a merger. The Article 1 courts that existed already in the territory were now going to be merged with the Article 3 courts.
Wow.
They merged them together into one court.
Oh, wow.
This is where the problems began.
Okay, so is that called the Idaho State Admission Act, or what would that be properly called?
Yeah, that is the admission into the union, Idaho's admission into the union. That's enabling legislation that the federal government had to pass
Okay.
in order
Okay.
to admit Idaho into the Union.
Okay. So are we good with the exclusive part as a general overview right now?
Oh no, we got a lot more to go.
Well, I mean, because I want to be able to define for the folks in the most simple terms is a definition of the exclusive and the concurrent. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, okay. Well, so if we're looking at so we're looking at the history of how
Or how
the
they're different.
exclusive jurisdiction, yeah, no problem. So we're looking at the how was this superior jurisdiction being used by the government in the federal government's land program? Very simple. It just made all of the judiciary and the legislative functions in the territory directly how would we say that, directly manageable or managed by the federal government. So look at it as a vassal state arrangement,
Yeah.
directly under federal tutelage.
Okay. And the vassal state
Okay.
again is just basically the fact that the states are inferior to the federal government and their job merely is to be able to peddle the federal narrative or control
Yeah,
mechanism.
I mean that's a really good way to say it right there.
Okay.
That's
All right, cool.
that's it in a nutshell. Okay, so
Okay.
you've got from the Louisiana Purchase on, and I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of why it's this way because it'll just be too confusing. But it ties back to our last video. From the Louisiana Purchase on, the program was being administered, the federal land program was being administered as a vassal state arrangement program.
Okay.
Okay, so this made sure that the exclusive power being wielded by the government was being held on to, even post admission. Even post admission. Okay, so we know now that the yeah, I know. Yeah, and it gets complicated. It really does because you got
People are like, wait a minute, it gets complicated. I can hear it now. No, it's okay. Sorry, keep going.
No, it's okay. So there is and I'm not going to get into this, but I'm going to bring it up. There's a portion of this that has to be talked about from the federal court lens, from their understanding as an incorporation issue, but we're not going to get into that because that'll just really muddy the water. All right. So you got this federal government that's exercising this exclusive power. All right. So let's talk about the concurrent power. So one might ask, well, then where does the concurrent power come in? Well, I'm glad you asked that. In the Organic Administration Act of 1897, Congress decided to create something called concurrent jurisdiction, in which they said that in the national forests, we are going to share jurisdiction with the states. They brought up this, and that's exactly how it's framed in the Organic Act, as a concurrent jurisdiction, and it was understood to be a shared jurisdiction. There was a couple elements that the federal government relinquished as part of its power. One of them was the police power. They relinquished the dominant police power to the state.
Okay. And police power is what everybody knows as police power? Or are you talking enforcement mechanism?
Well, both. Like the entire police power has to be looked at from the lens of the Supreme Court, because I don't think it's very well understood.
Okay.
So what is police power? Well, police power would be any enforcement of state power.
Okay.
That's the police power. That is enforcement of state power. That's legislative power, administrative power, doesn't matter what it is.
Okay. And so going back here. You said that according to the Organic Administrative Act of 1897, Congress created concurrent jurisdiction, and then you said something about national forest. If somebody was wanting to look up that, what would that be called? That document?
If they want to look up if they want to look up what I'm talking about in the act, it's the Organic Administration Act of 1897.
Okay, and
It is what.
is
Go ahead.
is that what is written? Is that where that power that Congress gave to the National Forest? Is that the National Forest mentioned in that?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
It's the act that created
okay,
the. Okay,
okay,
so we have
perfect.
to understand what we're talking about here. We have to understand what we're talking about. We're talking about a withdrawal. So the whole idea of creating national forests was to withdraw those forests out of the public domain and into something else, what they call withdrawals. It
Wow,
created the national forests.
I see. That's interesting. Okay,
So there's a lot of these withdrawals, and we don't want to get into them because it just muddies the water.
sure.
So where are we at? We got the national forests that are withdrawn out of the other properties
Hmm.
and made separate from them in a specific act. And this withdrawal is the beginning of the creation of the Forest Service, right? Because
Hmm.
once the forests are withdrawn, you have national forests nationwide.
Hmm.
Now you can create an administrative agency under the delegation of federal authority to manage those properties because they're
Mm,
withdrawn.
yeah, I see. Okay.
Okay.
And that jurisdiction and that administrative agency, which is really interesting because if it's shared, then the agency you would think would also be shared, but you can't create a shared agency. So was
Uh,
that agency was probably still under the federal exclusive jurisdiction because they actually created concurrent jurisdiction, which allowed them to be able to to maintain their exclusive jurisdiction. Yes?
well, the beginning of the whole Forest Service National Forest Program was understood that the federal Forest Service was going to have to operate under the shared jurisdiction.
Okay.
That was understood originally.
So where does the enforcement power then? So Congress creates this deal that allowed for the administrative agency to manage the national forest. Whose governance who is in charge of creating that agency and making sure that it works the way it's supposed to? The feds, right?
Okay, so you have a chain of command in the federal level. You're right. You got a chain of command.
Okay.
It begins for the federal lands. All of the federal lands are under the absolute management of the Department of the Interior.
Okay.
That's where it begins.
Okay.
The Department of Interior outsources portions of its administrative power to, say, the Department of Agriculture,
Mm,
the BLM, etc. Right?
mm,
NOAA for the
mm.
territorial seas,
I see.
the insular areas.
Mm-hmm.
So now the Department of Interior fractionates, or separates, or creates divisions of itself
Mm-hmm.
under the delegation of federal authority doctrine,
Maintaining Maintained under the federal jurisdiction is my point.
maintained under federal
Okay.
jurisdiction.
So it's shared, but it's not really shared because we're still looking at that sort of inferior vassal state arrangement in the fact that we're going to create this, we're going to allow things to be shared, but we're still going to maintain control ultimately.
Right. So
Okay.
there, as you can clearly see, you got some disputes going on here
Hmm.
that your mind can quickly grab onto and go, wait a minute, I see some shared jurisdiction. Anybody's brain can do this. Well, the same thing with these federal agency heads and personnel.
Hmm.
They're having similar problems, right?
Hmm.
So which jurisdiction are they asserting? Well, right now, they're asserting a exclusive jurisdiction.
Hmm.
And we found that in the Department of the Interior's internal documentation in their land classification system.
Okay.
So what we know for fact, because this was gathered from a FOIA request, that the Department of the Interior's internal land classification documentation showed that all federal land inside the United States, including the 100-mile wide border zone,
Mhm.
have been classified under exclusive jurisdiction from at least 1952 to at the latest 2013.
Wow. Okay. All right.
All of it, every scrap.
Okay. So did we do good? Did we do well on the concurrent part, or are you still going?
Well, so the concurrent, what is concurrent? So the concurrent
Means
is a
shared, right?
shared jurisdiction. And so the
Sort
question
of.
is, well, how much power does the federal government have in the region? How much power does the state
And the
have
crux
in
of
the
the issue.
region?
For sure.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
So you
So
get a
it
lot of
took a while
conflicts
to
here.
get here, but we're here right now.
Right.
Good
So,
job.
yeah, how much power does the state have in a shared jurisdiction? Well, first of all, you have to ascertain that the area in dispute is a shared jurisdiction area. That's the first thing, right? So
Mhm.
let's go to the border issue. Ken Paxton and the state of Texas, they believe that uh, um, they have some level of authority to issue an injunction to the Supreme Court of the United States under the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction for the purposes of stopping the border agencies and a DHS from exercising whatever control that they were exercising in the moment, trying to
Uh-huh.
stop them. That's what the injunction was supposed to do.
Right.
The Supreme Court of the United States did not agree with the injunction, and neither do I,
Mhm.
because if Ken Paxton and the state of Texas want to try to figure out what sort of power they have, what sort of power that Texas that DHS and ICE and all these agencies have, well, then an injunction is a wrong way to go about doing this,
Mhm. Well, I mean,
right?
anything relating to separation of powers issue, well, I never mind. I'll go ahead and reserve that comment.
Well, you can see how if you don't get the whatever it is that you're trying to do has to be right in the eyes of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court understands this issue. Do not think that they do not, right? It would be a bad idea. They understand this issue and they understand it very well. They're the ones that issued the Downs versus Bidwell decision. So they understand the different jurisdictions that the government has at its disposal. What it wants the states to do is it wants the Supreme Court is trying to get the states to create a question, do an investigation, figure out the relationship, find where there's a dispute
Mm-hmm.
where the federal government is
Encroaching,
is encroaching.
abusing its
Yes.
authority. Okay, so let me see if I got this right. So, and I've always been interested in why you think the Supreme Court has the power that it does, but that's a different thing. So you're saying, so if I understand it right, let's just say that there's a buffer zone around the border, right? 50 miles or 100 miles between the
100 miles.
actual border and, the miles inland, right?
Right.
Of the United States. If
Right.
that was an issue, let's just say that was all under exclusive jurisdiction or under federal control, right? Because that's their
Okay.
border, right? It's the border and they're supposed to protect the border and all that. So if the immediate issue, let's just say, is within that 100 miles, then the state doesn't really have that authority because it's within the federal jurisdiction. Is that right?
If the exclusive power was gained lawfully, then that would be true.
That's true. So the only problem really comes from, so there's essentially, I'm looking at this as two borders. You have the border between Mexico and the United States, and 100 miles in or 50 miles in, what is it? 50 miles? 60, I think it's like
Yes, 50
60.
miles. So it's 50 miles from the border north and 50 miles from the border south.
Okay, okay. So let's just say, so I think, so from what you're saying, and I'm hoping I'm right as always, that I'm right. I am hoping. So we have the border between Canada and Mexico, and then
Yep.
50 miles inward, we have another border. and it's not
Right.
defined. It's not clearly, marked, but that is the line between state control or or state jurisdiction and the federal jurisdiction. Would that be a fair way to sort of simplify what I'm looking at? So in other words,
Yeah,
the states, if they could exercise their full 10th Amendment authority, which we'll also get to, um, within that 100 miles and inside, that then becomes under state jurisdiction. So the feds have control of the border 50 miles from the Canadian American border, but the states take control inside of that 50 miles and inward. Is that right?
no, the way that the federal government is
I could explain
classifying
that.
its board, yeah. So again, the border zone is considered to be under exclusive jurisdiction. That's what it's considered to be under. The question that nobody's asking is, did they obtain that jurisdiction lawfully? Nobody's asking that question.
Okay.
What
Okay.
do they have to do to apply the jurisdiction lawfully to the border zone? They have to purchase the land from the state.
The federal government does?
Yes, under 1817.
Ooh, that's interesting. So if I missed it, maybe everybody else missed it too. So restate what you just said. So I'm living in the world where if the federal government, through the federal constitution or whatever, is supposed to be protecting our border, and we've defined a 50-mile buffer zone, that would automatically be exclusive jurisdiction under the feds, right?
I wouldn't ask the question that way. I think it's misleading.
Okay. So how would you ask it
I
or
would
state
ask
it?
you this way. Does the United States Constitution give a grant of power to the general government to seize land in the states to create the border?
No.
If it doesn't, what is the other mechanism constitutionally that must be used?
Interesting. Well, the
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17.
1817. Okay. Okay.
Have they done that? No, they have not. Can
Okay.
they apply exclusive jurisdiction in the border zone? No, they cannot.
Okay. All right. So if the border was 6 inches wide, would they, I'm just throwing it out there. If the border was 6 inches wide and they could walk along the fence line, would they have exclusive jurisdiction on on the border itself?
If they bought it from the state, sure.
That's interesting because a nation is usually defined by its borders, right? So nobody
Yeah, so this is
necessarily thinks about
the
this.
people of the United States and the states are giving the federal government a pass here. That's
Okay.
what they're doing.
Okay.
So I think the people in the states better have a freaking conversation about whether or not they want to keep giving the United States government a pass.
Okay. We got that. So now we get into some of the minutia, and I don't want to derail you because if you think we're going off on a tangent, pull me back. But a lot of people are emotional about this. You've got Governor Abbott that came out and said the compact was broken, and obviously it clearly looks like it is, even according to what you said. Then the federal government decides that it wants to use its administrative agencies to be able to trump the power and the authority of the state. And then yet some people, even some of these patriot groups, are still going, well, yeah, I mean, they should exercise the 10th Amendment. I think it's important for us to recognize something that I learned in your book. And it was really, it came back at me like a, oh my gosh moment. And that was if a particular state, right, and most of the states in the West are owned to great percentages by the federal government, can a state actually exercise its 10th Amendment sovereign authority to nullify, interpose, whatever against the federal government if the federal government owns like 40% of the land of the state?
It depends on the issue.
Would it also depend, like you just said earlier, on whether the federal government had lawfully acquired that land?
Yeah, so in the issue with the border, in order for the government to be able to hold its position legally, like you've pointed out in your scenario, they would have to be able to do it through the exclusive jurisdiction. Well, they don't. They got a shared jurisdiction. It was a compact, a handshake agreement between the states and the federal government that the federal government would discharge its Article 4, Section 4 powers by just handshake agreement and taking over that in a shared jurisdiction with the states. So the federal government cannot dictate policy to the states if the federal government is not doing its end of the bargain.
Okay. So here's a question for you. So federal government is, I think part of, if unless I'm mistaken, the federal government was given power to be able to one of the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation was its inability to be able to work on things relating to protecting our nation, right? So the federal
Right.
government could come in and say, okay, well, this is state land. How are we supposed to exercise our power under the federal government to protect the borders if you're going to go ahead and claim, that the states have power, we're not allowed. So is that another handshake agreement where the states say, okay, in order for you guys to be able to exercise, your constitutional authority of defending the borders, we are allowing you to be able to occupy state land until such time as we don't need you?
Well, I think the handshake agreement that was between the states and the federal government wasn't really predicated on that premise. It was just predicated on the federal government saying we are going to discharge our Article 4, Section 4 power of protecting the states against invasion. We're going to do that, and the states go, we trust you to do your job.
Okay,
That's all that was.
So if they have to come into the particular state, then the states will grant them the authority as long as they're doing what they're supposed to.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, if the states go, well, wait a minute, you're not discharging your, so then it's like Ken Paxton says, or Abbott is saying, well, they broke the contract.
Right.
Or the compact, or whatever they're calling it. Well, it was a handshake agreement to begin with. So if one party's not going to uphold their end of the bargain, why should the other party? So if the states are going to be forced to take their land back and then take and seize, and protect themselves against invasion, well, the article. So then the question is, how is the federal government going to discharge its Article 4, Section 4 power if it's actively engaged in the opposite of it?
Amen. That's true. Yeah, it's true. It's true. And then you have the Biden administration that's getting involved, empowering these agencies like DHS, to punish the state guards, citizens that are defending their border. I don't know to what degree that's going to go. What do you think about that?
Say that again.
So I don't know if I can remember how. So you have the citizens down there. I saw a video on TikTok, I think, with a bunch of tractors. Man, that was impressive. Whether it was the border or not, it was still pretty cool. Where you have the citizens that are defending their borders. You've got the agricultural communities defending their borders. You've got ICE and the other, customs and stuff that are on our side that are trying to defend their border. You've got the Biden administration that's empowering the DHS and Homeland Security to be able to reprimand all of those people that are defending the border. This is a recipe for a civil war, isn't it?
It could be. So let's address the citizen involvement issue where they're sending where the truckers are going to go down there and they're going to get involved. It's like, okay, we just talked earlier about the exclusive power being a displacement of private rights, meaning that the federal government's rights are superior to the citizens.
Mhm.
And well, if they can't apply exclusive power, then they can't displace private rights.
Mhm.
And what is one of the citizens' private right? There's a whole bunch of private rights, but one of them is the right of locomotion.
Mhm.
Right? They also have a right to protect their property. So
Mhm.
if there are private citizens on the border where the invasions are doing what's called a regulatory taking, they're engaged in something called a regulatory taking, meaning that the government's exercise of regulatory power takes something from a United States citizen. The only way that they can't even do that in an exclusive manner, you see, because the exclusive jurisdiction, we're finding out, isn't lawfully being applied in many instances, not just the border. It's not being lawfully applied.
Mhm.
So the exclusive power is slowly being rolled back by the United States Supreme Court. Why? Because it's not being lawfully applied. So all these citizens, they're going to go down to the border and they're going to get engaged in whatever, as long as they're lawful and they're protecting their private property, they have a constitutional right to do so, because nothing in the government's power prevents it.
Well, if
Nothing.
if you have the Biden administration, for example, and I mean I go deeper than that, but he's just the puppet of the de jure. But you have the Biden administration that's empowering DHS. DHS has no understanding of what rights actually are. So when they're down there, the citizens really have to say, okay, I could, they're supposed to be, I'm in a position where my rights can be protected, but nobody's going to acknowledge those rights. So it's almost as if they're exercising exclusive jurisdiction anyway.
Well, one of the things that's a problem for the government right now is if everybody understands that they've been trying to apply this exclusive right in all these different situations, and because they've been doing it clandestinely, that's how they've gotten away with it. Nobody knows about it because they've been doing it clandestinely. Well, if this gets out into the mainstream media that they've been applying their exclusive power all over the United States in all these different nefarious ways, what's going to happen to the government's exclusive power? We're not going to be able to apply it clandestinely anymore. They lose, they lose, they lose. This was whoever did this is not very bright.
Yeah, and it's really weird because the conspiratorial, part of life that I've been looking at would show brilliance, absolute brilliance in the ability to subjugate the American people and the globe to, to agenda, while people just still consider it a conspiracy theory. So,
right.
So we have 25 states supposedly that are on board with this. It's interesting that we only have half of them. I'm not surprised by the states that are not on board. And I don't really want to get involved in politics too much. Do you think other states will jump on?
Yeah, I think it all depends, right? So there's some states, the coastal states, they're pretty much sold out to whatever agenda that the federal government wants to apply to them, right? Because look, let's just be honest, that the vassal state arrangement that the federal government realized that it could create in the Western United States, it also has been very adept at applying across the United States, this vassal state arrangement. And there's a multitude of ways that the government can apply this vassal arrangement, right? Federal funding programs, through its exclusive power ran clandestinely, its properties. It's like there's a whole bunch of ways. And so there's a lot of states that have been feeding at the federal trough and still feed at the federal trough. So some of the states that are sending National Guard units down to help out on the border really surprised me, because I know that a lot of their funding comes from federal sources, like
Idaho does.
Right, 60%.
This is an election year. I'm not surprised that Little during an election year. It's kind of ironic too. People don't understand that he's a big proponent of climate change, which is a United Nations model, that completely violates our sovereignty, but yet he's supporting, he's making an effort that would make people believe that he actually cares about our national sovereignty. So that's really interesting. So I got a question about nullification. So, we've seen instances of nullification before. It's really interesting to me. I mean, I think that we had, and maybe I just don't know, I can't pull off the examples. I think, abortion, sanctuary cities, illegal immigration, we welcome the refugees. And the only thing that the federal government has been able to do to reprimand the states that have actually nullified federal law is to be able to say, okay, we withhold your funding.
Right.
But this is an interesting deal because they haven't, to my knowledge, they haven't been discussed. They're going farther than just pulling back on the funding for the state of Texas. Why is this so much different?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of court cases that sort of drive what you're talking about, right? There's a court case in 1987, I think it was, 82, 87, something like that, and it's called South Dakota versus Dole. And in South Dakota versus Dole, the federal court said, okay, look, the federal government can run these programs, these funding programs to get done some sort of its agenda in that administration that it wants to do. It can do that. There's nothing stopping the federal government from doing that. However, we're going to place some limitations on that exercise. They created a 5-point criteria that in order for it to be a legitimate exercise of the government's program funding mechanism, that it had to abide by all these criteria, right? So if you have 1 point of the criteria where the government's not adhering to, you've got a challenge. Now, whether or not you overcome, you can win on that single challenge. You really want at least 2, right? So you got 2 points of the criteria where the government's in defiance of. You're probably for sure going to win in this scenario. So you got South Dakota versus Dole. The second consideration that we want to look at is what happened in the PPACA. This is a Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. There was a decision that the court made here regarding forcing states to abide by a federal program using extensive coercion measures, right? In this case, it was not so much the states, it was against the people, stating that we will penalize you for not enrolling in Obamacare, right? The federal government, right? So this is what they were doing. We're going to penalize you for not enrolling. Remember that?
Yeah, I do. I remember that.
Well, so the federal court, the Supreme Court of the United States, they've already sort of taken a position on the exercise of the federal government's spending clause, right? They've already taken this up, and it was taken up in South Dakota versus Dole, and and there's a bunch of cases that are associated with the Dole decision. You can look them up. So what they had to do is they had to tell the government, look, you cannot compel the people to engage in a program. You can't do it. You can't. That's force. Right? It's a force. And you're trying to use these as force multipliers to force compliance to an agenda. You just can't do it. Right?
So let corporations do it instead.
Right.
There we go.
Now you got it. And the corporations are figuring this out. That if they want, that's why they're creating the public-private partnerships. We're digressing. All right. So the outcome of that decision was that, okay, not only are we going to tell you, federal government, that you cannot compel the citizens to enroll in the program and then punish them for not doing it, but we're going to tell you that the only way that you can apply this penalty is as a tax.
So they determined that it was a tax.
Right. So they converted it from a penalty to a tax in the PPAC decision. Now that's how they get it. Well, once you gutted the decision of its enforcement, its compulsory enforcement power, it was just a matter of time before Obamacare became a thing of the past. And look at it, it's not a very big thing. It gutted the power of Obamacare. So this is the history of the government is one of compulsion. They're trying to figure out ways. Since they can't use their exclusive power, so they're trying to figure out ways to use their enumerated grants of power to create forcing mechanisms to force certain outcomes. And the Supreme Court's going, no, you're losing the whole point of the grant of the power in the first place. So
I'm seeing the one thing that I'm seeing that really just can't be denied anymore. And I try to be quiet about it sometimes, but there's no point because I know what side I'm on. In the study of incremental globalism, which people have a hard time believing, it's really about time that they do. But I'm looking at documentation that is astounding. Trade agreements, for example, the new Declaration for North America, the Declaration of Interdependence. Looking at the history of the formation of the EU, the USMCA trade agreement, you go back to Bush and Clinton with NAFTA and all that. Those are all about political and economic integration to abolish sovereignties. And what I mean by that even is borders, creating a regional style government. And in an effort to be able to do that, it is necessary that the border is abolished. And so my argument when I saw Texas was, this is a really, really great opportunity with all the illegals coming across the border and exercising cloud and pivot and collapsing our economy and all that, to be able to force the southern border to remain open, to be able to move toward that regional style government, um, which the Declaration of North America clearly defines, the political and economic integration between, oh, was it Vicente Fox at the time and uh, Tony Blair, I think at the time, and then whatever president it was at the time. So there's this regional element going on, and I'm looking at this land issue, as it I'm looking at this land issue to be able to see how it fits, and where one place where it does fit, not only with the border issue and the federal government's desire to leave an open border, but was finding a way to be able to suspend the Constitution or contort the Constitution and agitate the states by circumventing its authority by empowering corporations and NGOs. And NGOs, for the most part, are certified UN NGOs, non-governmental agencies that have been empowered through I would say, the administrative state to be able to do all of these things without any limitations. Do you know about that? Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So you're alluding to something, and you're smart because in what I'm talking about here regarding the application of exclusive power or concurrent power to the border, there is a potential weakness, right? So if the states decide, hey, the federal government and us, we had a compact, they broke it, we're going to take the borders back over, it's going to, and the federal government says, okay, we're hands off, we're not going to apply our Article 4, Section 4 power anymore, that opens the borders up across the United States. Now we're in a real mess.
Yeah, we are.
So the question is, how do we deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
mm-hmm.
the states are better off issuing a writ of mandamus to the Supreme Court to force the United States government to do its job under the handshake agreement than it is, and the states cannot give up that land to the federal government so that it can obtain exclusive jurisdiction. It may be wanting the states to do that, which is why they're opening up the borders.
Yeah.
If these guys are really smart, like if you're the federal government and you're trying everything in your power to gain exclusive jurisdiction wherever you can get it, what would you do? You would force the states to complain about the situation, and then drive them into it, and then you drive the federal government into a court situation where you think you've got them beat, and they go, well, we don't have exclusive jurisdiction, so we can't apply our full authority. And the states go, well, how do we give it to you to fix the problem? You see what I mean?
Yeah, if they give up their ability to defend the border in Texas, does that automatically mean by default that the border is open on all of the border states?
Well, this is one of
each state issue.
I'm not sure about the question. Can you ask it a different way?
You can think of if so. Let's just say Texas calls out the feds, and the feds go, you know what? Sorry, we're not, we'll go ahead and back off, but we're not going to be in control of your border anymore. That would just be for the state where that disagreement existed, right? It wouldn't just by default open up the borders across all of the border states the southern states in our country, right?
It potentially could, because the entire 100-mile border zone is all under the same jurisdiction.
That's exactly where I was going.
You can't apply, you can't apply the jurisdiction to this tiny strip and not apply it everywhere else.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if they do that, then it's just one more step forward if they're not forced to do that, to where they don't actually have to close the borders or abolish the border completely. One question I have, and I don't know, I think we're about an hour 10. So I hope people will still watch it, because I think it's great. So, you ever get allowance from your mom? You're like, Mom, can I have $10? I want to go to a concert. She's like, yeah, but you know what? In order for me to give you the $10, you're going to need to wash the car, and you can't get drunk and end up in the hospital. You know, you have to, so you have this arrangement, right? And she gives you money in exchange, you do what she wants you to do. Well, in this particular case, if I'm not grammatically challenged here, or um, metaphorically challenged, which I usually am, and I don't have a post-stroke moment.
Yeah.
Since most of the states are increasingly reliant on federal government money, the states really could, if they wanted to, they could try to be able to exercise their 10th Amendment, right? With the average understanding of what's going on, right? They could exercise their 10th Amendment, whether it doesn't matter how much federal land is owned by the state or how much money that the states have taken from the federal government. They could say, we don't care. We're defending our border anyway. They could do that, couldn't they?
Well, it all depends because in the western states, Idaho's not a border. Well, actually, we are a border state because we border Canada. So let's look
We
at
border
Idaho. It's like,
California.
okay, yeah, it's like, okay, can we just ask a question? Let's just ask a question. Can the state of Idaho apply its 10th Amendment power, not just to the border, but pretty much throughout the state of Idaho? The answer to the question is no.
Well, because of the federal land ownership. But if the states decided to be able to say, we don't really care about that, you know, we took your money, it's our money anyway. We decided that we were going to do this. The states really could, couldn't they? And they could just say, you know what, we're doing it, right? What
Well,
would be the mechanism that would stop the states from saying, we don't care how much money you've given us. You've broken you know, you've endangered our state. So therefore, we are going to, you know, we're not even going to look at the amount of money that you gave us. We're not going to look at your jurisdiction, even though it's federally owned. We're going to do this because this is the right thing to do to, you know, to protect our state. Could they do that?
the states could do it, but there's going to be legal challenges from here to Christmas, and they're not
Sure.
going to win. They're not going to win probably the bulk of them.
But so this, when we break down to this degree, obviously it's unlawful. We know it is for the states, but on the other hand, according to principle, sure, we have an agreement with the Constitution and we have all of those things, and those are, you know, binding agreements or whatever, even though the states, I think Idaho says it's a, you know, perpetual part of the union or whatever, which I think they could probably rescind if they wanted to. But if the states are in a crisis where people are dying and the federal government has already broken their a portion of their contract, is there something in law that says that if there's a part of the contract that has been broken, the whole contract is null and void?
Um,
Because I think I read that in law somewhere, um, and that's why they have to put the clause in a lot of legal documents saying, you know, just because one part of the contract might be disputed, the rest of the contract is supposed to remain, um, is supposed to remain. I guess maybe I'm getting down into the weeds. I'm just trying to, if push comes to shove, you know, I see the possibility of the state saying, we don't really care what happened. Our job right now is to be able to take care of our state and the citizens. The federal government can do whatever the hell it wants. If the people are going to file against the state is still within itself. So we could literally eject anybody that tries to be able to launch any sort of legal challenge to the state. I mean, now I'm getting into rebellion and I'm getting into, you know, agitation and I'm getting into, you know, pre-Civil War, I guess. But ultimately, the only thing that you're telling me, if I understand it right, is if the state decided to say, you broke your contract, we're breaking ours, um, the only recourse the federal government would have would be what? I mean, if you think about it, if our
well,
founders,
let's look at it this way, Tom. People don't look at it the right way, so I'm going to help them look at it the right way.
okay,
And I'm
focus.
going to put it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it through using a story.
Okay,
Let's say, Tom, you're going through a divorce.
okay,
You in the marriage, you brought in a house and your car, and she brought in a house, her car, and her children.
hmm
Okay,
hmm
and you guys sign a prenup where it was acknowledged that you brought in your things and she brought in her things. When you guys divorce and separate,
hmm
what are you taking with you?
Well, if I'm lawfully abiding to whatever the decree is, I'm taking whatever I came in with.
That's what the states are going to be faced with in the scenario that you're putting down. The states are going to be faced with a scenario where they signed a prenup
Mhm.
And if they have a divorce with the federal government, they're only leaving with what they went in with.
Okay. So if they leave whatever they're going in with, then the state gets to be able to pull itself out. So how does the state recoup the money? How does the federal government recoup the money or uh go after the states for the millions of dollars that we've taken every single year because we're completely insolvent? I mean, you know, and they wouldn't really have any authority unless what they called in the blue hats.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how to speculate on that, but I can make the assessment from everything from a legal perspective just based on what I know of the history.
Okay.
And
And
I can
maybe we
tell you
shouldn't,
exactly what's going to happen.
and we probably shouldn't be talking Bob Wise and wherefores anyway, but I mean, I see that, it's kind of funny with all of these things going on in the country. There's one I've learned a lot about the Constitution. And
Yeah,
it isn't
right.
there's some, we learned a lot together when I first started, and I've read lots of books and learned about the 14th Amendment, learned about proper ratification, and I've learned about Article 5, and I've learned about all these things, but the real learning comes from these real world scenarios where, the left is like, well, we're going to create Chaz or CHOP, or, we're going to create an abortion sanctuary city, or we're going to do this. And so it's like, God, will you guys knock it off? I mean, I see all of these as constitutional crises, not necessarily between the feds and the states, but I'm like, whoa. And so I'm constantly moving around to every issue going, okay, now what's the constitutional answer for this? And it's really incredible how much I've learned just from dealing with like this Texas issue, or what happened anywhere else. Um, so I guess we should probably finish up. But Ron, I think in summary, I like to talk about the problem, where it came from, and I like to be able to end videos on action items. They might, in this case, it might not be an action for individuals per se. If there are, let's include those. If there are actions that you think that the states should be engaged in, let me know. If there's things that you think that you're going to be doing, it'd be cool to talk about that. And if there are things that you think the federal government should be doing, let's talk about some of those, what some of those solutions might be, okay?
Well, yeah. So one of the things that we're okay. So I wanted to get ahead of the exclusive jurisdiction issue on in this video because it's causing a constitutional crisis,
Mhm.
and we have to get ahead of it because we're going to have to navigate through it, and it's
Right.
going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And as we're navigating through this conversation, I can tell that you're feeling trapped. It's like, how do we get out of this?
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen moving forward. Everyone's going to feel trapped in a situation that's not easily recognizable how to get out of it.
Right.
Okay. Are there things that we can do? Absolutely. And they're being done. It's taking this stuff to court, getting decisions. It's moving the federalism needle back toward dual federalism, which the Supreme Court's already doing. It's passing legislation nationally and locally to help resolve some of these disputable issues before they turn into a real crisis and we start hurling lead at one another.
Right. For sure.
Okay. And then ultimately, what's going to happen is we're going to have a transformation of the federal court system. And by virtue of that, a transformation of the state court system. Those are those things that if we don't do them, we will be in a civil war.
Mhm. Okay. So what kinds of things show, we have, I think a lot of people are still questioning what the proper authority is of some of these people that are elected. We have a governor, we have AGs. So is there anything that the citizens should convey to the governor, perhaps? Should the citizens be engaged in any dialogue or anything with the AGs? Are there other people that we should be appealing to, and what should we be appealing to them with?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening right now, federally and at the state level.
Mhm.
Um I think this issue is very difficult to man, it's very difficult to talk about solutions right now
Okay.
because I just don't think that I've given enough information to people to even navigate this issue right now, let alone, a month from now when things really heat up. It's like I just don't, I'm not confident that we're going to suddenly have a mastery of the jurisdictions that are being employed here so that we can get ourselves out of them. Like the only way out of these jurisdictional problems that we have
Hmm.
are going to be through legislation,
Hmm.
and they're going to be through judicial action.
Okay.
It's the
So we
only way
can,
out.
so then what we can do is, so what we can do is we can empower citizens, right? I mean, if we're going to do legislation, then the citizens should be informed enough by reading the History of Federal Lands in the United States by Ronald Nielsen, uh,
That'll help.
uh,
Yeah, that'll help.
and watching our videos. The other thing too is that I think at a most basic level, based on the average ignorance of people, maybe, is to be able to go in with a concern for the immigration, the collapsing of our health and welfare system, the collapse of our country, the fact that something needs to be done. I mean, I think that pressure from the citizens to our state legislature would be one mechanism to be able to create that kind of pressure on them at the very least, right?
Yeah. So the question I would have to citizens is what, how are you going to apply? Okay, let's just take Texas.
We'll
Ken
play, we'll
Paxton.
role play.
Yeah, role play. Ken Paxton, AG, and the legislature of Texas. What is your letter going to say to them that you think that they need to do?
They need to close the border. That's what everybody says. You need to close the border and stop the illegals from coming across the border, even though they
So
think even though it's not really the issue.
is that to say that the state needs to take over immigration on its borders within its state?
They're not thinking that far.
Right. So
Yeah.
the question is, what do you want to see happen here?
I want to
Right.
see the
Because
Yeah. So if we were going to role play, and you could say, Tom, and you asked me that question, I'd say, Ron, um, I would really like to be able to see the people that are illegal stop coming across the border. The other thing I'd like the thing to do is if the federal government is in charge of protecting our borders and preventing, you know, illegals from coming across we need to apply pressure to the degree necessary to be able to force the states, pressure the states to be able to pressure the federal government to be able to honor their um I would say part of the compact with protecting the border.
yeah, so right there. I think you nailed it right there. I think the citizens of Texas should all send letters to Ken Paxton and the legislature and say, we want you to issue a writ of mandamus to the United States government, forcing them to do their Article 4, Section 4 duty.
Okay, but we could also, since we know that if something happens, so here's my view. Okay, so if I say, Ron, I'm paying attention to something on a completely different degree. It's on a global level. I see regionalization on the horizon. I see the eventual, borders being abolished. I'm very, very concerned about Texas because I believe that what happens in Texas is going to be happening everywhere in every southern state because they have to abolish the border. That's what the federal government's desire to do is. And what we need to do is I think I think the founders actually said it. They said if it was found that one of the states was abusing their power and the authority, that they were reliant or they were hoping that some of the other states would come along and to help correct that state, right? Well, so
Yeah,
in this
right.
in the same reference, I would say that if Idaho is not a border state, for example, or some of these other states are not border states, that the border states that are really, really concerned that are going on in the border should be coming to the aid of Texas, and they should be applying resistance to, by contacting Ken Paxton as well. Why wouldn't, if this is the one mechanism where the doors are wide open in Texas to be able to collapse our country, why couldn't the country itself recognize that gaping hole and to be able to say this is garbage and then apply pressure to that one particular state? Could we not do that?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely you can
So
do that.
that's
And
so that's
I mean,
definitely an
but
action item that
eventually,
we can
Tom,
do.
eventually, Tom, what's going to happen is you're going to have a solution,
Right.
not a band-aid,
Right.
but a solution.
Right.
And the solution is going to have to do two things. Number one, it's going to have to take into consideration the government's Article 4, Section 4 constitutional duty. Then it's going to have to take into consideration who owns the property. Then it's going to have to take into consideration some sort of an agreement between the state that owns the property and or the citizens that own the property and the United States government's Article 4, Section 4 duty.
Right.
And so when you take all of the elements into consideration, most people don't even want to get that far,
Right.
let alone get to the negotiation that's going to have to take place.
But they're really good at complaining though. And so I
That's
think
right.
I've seen some things happen where when there's enough, like for example, and I love to bring this up because it's nowhere to be found on the internet, but Butch Otter decided that he wanted to give 30,000 acres to the communist Chinese. Remember that
Oh
south of the
yeah,
airport? Oh my
I
God.
remember that.
All
Yeah,
right. One more stab against Butch Otter, man. Even though he's a super nice guy, at least he was to me. But that was a horrible thing. And you got Brad Little that's
yeah,
in support of climate change. Now he's flip-flopping. He's like, "Oh, well, I'm a globalist, but I really believe in national sovereignty." So he's a
yeah.
hypocrite. But it's still but the cool thing that I use about Butch Otter, and I use this as a mechanism to help people understand what success looks like. So
Right.
what did the people do? The people found out about that and they went bonkers. They're like, "Wait a minute, what?" You know, we created so much resistance and so much, momentum that the governor had no choice but to back away from it. And not only did he back away from it, there's not a story on the internet about it. And
Yeah,
so I think that successes can be had. I want to
absolutely.
empower, my desire is to be able to empower citizens to the greatest degree that I can by taking something this complex and say, look, this is not something that you just put in the hands of somebody else. You still have a role to play. If this is your republic, then you should be able to take some part at some level, whether it's educating your neighbors or having, town hall meetings in your local communities or whatever it is to be able to create a general awareness of what is going on and what needs to be required, and then giving people specific action steps to be able to feel like they were involved in the process of trying to right the ship. And part of that is a lot of people are just complaining. It's like, okay, well, complaining to me isn't going to help. Complaining to you isn't going to help. But maybe you can start finding out who your legislator is and start going, wait a minute, what the hell is going on here? And then once our legislators start getting 10, 20, 30,000, emails, if they ever get that much or whatever, if we apply enough pressure, the legislature is going to recognize the fact that something needs to be done. And it didn't take long, thank God, and thank goodness, because we have some Liberty legislators that are already trying to write legislation regarding the border. Now, I haven't looked at the bill. Most of the things that they write in support of liberty, I'm absolutely dumbfounded at, but that's beside the point. What my point is that it didn't take much resistance at this point for the legislature to be able to create something relating to the Texas border issue. Now, imagine if we can magnify that 100-fold or 1,000-fold. I
If the
can't
people
imagine that we wouldn't have more success than we are now.
if the people blew up Ken Paxton's phone, I mean, literally just
Yep.
blew up his phone and
Yep.
put him in a situation where he knows that he has to use the law
Mm,
to get some sort of favorable opinion, it
mm.
would force him in his office to extinguish every possibility that they have at their disposal in court. And that's what they need to do. So the people should be blowing his phone up.
Do you have his phone number?
You can get it on the internet, I heard.
I'll look it up. Well,
Yeah.
if you tell people to call Ken Paxton, they're going to go, well, which Ken Paxton? There's 42 of them on Facebook. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to find the number for you. So I thought maybe if we were lucky enough and had the phone number, we'll go ahead and include this, but I'll go ahead and maybe put it in the comment section and maybe perhaps some people will be engaged. But the whole point of the video for me is to be able to share information, empower the citizens, help them understand something from the most rare perspective possible, and the most advantageous perspective too, I might add, but to be able to give them things to do. And I think that we've done that. And I think we've probably stretched this out to about an hour and a half, which was exceeding our limitations by about a half hour. So,
Well, you asked if we should do two videos, and I'm like, no, I think we can fit it into
I know,
one. I
right?
just, yeah,
Yeah, well, so we did whatever it is. I always feel like it's better to do than not to do. So whether it's an hour and a half or not, at least we did it and we have a record of it. Was there anything that you wanted to include, any parting wisdom that you want to share with anybody before we terminate the
Well, if
conversation?
it was me and I was, and I wanted to try to get the Texas legislature and the attorney general's office really going here, I would send them a copy of my book. I'm already, me and a friend, we're already writing a letter. We're going to send them a letter, right?
Nice.
We're going to send a letter to the AG's office, and we're going to send a letter to the AG's office in all 25 states that are sending support down there. So we're already working on that.
Would petitions? No, that probably wouldn't work. Never mind.
Well, so anything that leads the attorney general's office to issue the writ of mandamus to the federal court to force the federal government to do its Article 4, Section 4 duty.
Okay.
That's what we want.
See, you need to add a blog to your website so you can put that down there so people can copy and paste it. It'd be great.
Yeah. It'd be great.
We'd increase traffic some. Anyway, perhaps in the future. Cool.
I think that's coming, Tom. I think we're gonna have to do something like that pretty soon.
We are, man. Let's blow it up. Make it happen. So I guess at this point I should say thanks, Ron, for joining me on this thing. And I think that we covered Texas pretty good. I think we went into the weeds a little bit in the beginning, but it's a complicated subject matter. People may or may not understand it right off the bat. I try to act as the other guy going, wait a minute, help me understand what this means. And so that I hope that I helped and stuff. And I'm just really parroting the this more simple version of Ron's book. But anyway, so we are going to continue to roll on the series of his book for as long and whenever we can. And so continue to look for those. Hopefully these will all be posted on a video page that he'll have up in his website at some point. Anyway, if you found the video, we thank you. Please share it, copy it, paste it to whoever you think would benefit from it, and look out for more videos. So Ron, thanks a lot, and I appreciate you a bunch, and we'll see you soon, huh?
All right, Tom. Thanks a lot, buddy.
Okay, bud. Bye.
Bye.